I think that's what we all do to get it working.
Hi everyone, this is John Gallant. Welcome to episode 1 of Coding with John. In this first episode, I've invited Vita, David Fowler, and Dan Wahlin to explore bringing an application I wrote from Docker Kompose all the way to Azure Kubernetes Service. We're going to be looking at Docker, Kompose, local Kubernetes deployments, AKS deployments, Skaffold, and a new project from the .NET team called Project Tye. In this new series, we're just going to be coding and exploring and learning together. I'd love to keep creating these videos as this first episode was super fun for me and I learned a ton. So if you want to see more of these videos, please do. Give a like, subscribe, comment, share on Twitter, and just let me know in any way that you can that you like this video. So let's get right to episode 1.
So I'm V. I'm an engineer in the commercial software engineering group at Microsoft. And I've been focusing in the containers and Kubernetes space for the past 4 years. 4 years? Yeah, 4 years. And I'll just be here trying to get this app running locally on a Kubernetes cluster and then in Azure and AKS.
Cool. David?
I'm David. I'm an architect on the .NET team with a focus on kind of cloud and backend services. I learned Kubernetes last year. So I'm here just to help out where I can.
Nice. Dan?
Yeah, so I'm Dan Wahlin. I've been at Microsoft for a whole 2 weeks now, end of my second week. So I'm just still learning how to log in, it feels like. But no, I've been working with containers for a long time and love Kubernetes. I'm a little more from the developer side of Kubernetes, though, not the admin side.
So let me just go through the app. So this is the Azure SDK Demo App. What it does is it imports or sucks in, ingests an image and extracts the text from that image and then analyzes the sentiment of it and then changes the border color depending on that sentiment. So if it's green, it's positive. If it's yellow, it's mixed. If it's red, it's negative. It's not perfect, but it's a good example of how to tie together a bunch of the Azure SDKs. So this version is written in .NET, and I'll bring you through the code here. So in the and I'm actually going to write these in all of the various languages, but in the .NET version, we basically have 3 main parts to it. And let me zoom in a bit. An API with a single controller, the image controller, and that accepts an image. It gets images, and it gets images by ID. That also has an image hub, which is a Signal R hub that does some polling. So as you're here and you click Add Random Meme, you notice it will add the image. And then we're using Signal R to query the Cosmos database. And so when all of that processing is done, it will update the border color there. And then we also have a Blazor web app here, and it has a single page, just index here. You can see it's outputting messages in the back, and you can see here that image was processed, and it went. And I'm logging all of the activity that's happening on the queue and Cosmos and everything.
Question.
Yeah.
Is that a storage queue?
Yeah, so
or is that a Azure? Okay.
Yep. So in the API, actually, great question. So in the controller, inside of this enqueue image async method, here we have enqueue image. So if one's not passed in, I dynamically get one from this meme Reddit meme endpoint. I'm streaming it. I'm uploading to blob storage, and then I'm putting a message in the queue. Okay. And this is a storage queue. So we're putting it to the queue. Okay. Now in the service, let's find that service. We have a queue service, and that is does some initialization to get all the clients ready, and then it's just doing a while true and getting messages from the queue. And it is using form recognizer to OCR, basically extract the text from the image. So we aggregate all that text there. And then we are getting that text and sending it to the text analytics client and getting the sentiment back. So it's either positive, mixed, neutral, negative. And then we are storing that in Cosmos and then deleting the message queue. And that is just on an infinite loop. And so the reason why I have services queue service, I plan to take this to any n number of service options, service bus, event hubs, event grid, whatever. Whenever we get a new SDK out, that's when I plan on implementing a new backend service. Obviously, there'll be changes to the API to accommodate that as well. Also, backend storage, like we're working on a table storage library right now, and so I'm going to redesign this a little bit to use either table or Cosmos. Yeah, and so then when the page loads, we just get the images. We initialize the hub connection. And then, just boilerplate like handle form control stuff. So that is the app. And so I got all of this running, and I was...
Question.
Yeah.
Env.load, what is that doing?
So I use env files a lot. Like pretty much every app I build, I'm using an env file because all of these... So it works with .NET, it works with Python, it works with any language has some sort of env loader. And, if I'm in .NET and I'm setting things in, say, web app settings or whatever it is, or, in the API, I'm looking at some settings here. I don't want to have to dig through all of these various apps to set settings, right? Everything basically is driven from this env file here.
I see.
And so when I create my Azure resources, it outputs my endpoints. I just copy and paste to that env file, and then everything just works.
Right.
Yep. And
so
yeah.
If this were more idiomatic for .NET, it would use the configuration provider that was built into .NET, which kind of supports multiple config sources.
Okay.
It could be environment variables. It could be a file on disk, and they kind of compose that way. And then the intent is that when you use Kubernetes or anything, you basically override the settings in the local app settings settings with something else.
Gotcha.
We don't have an M-file provider per se, but yeah.
Yeah, it would be actually something to look into. Is should we build an M-file provider?
Yeah, that seems reasonable.
Yeah. Yeah, especially
real quick, John. I'll have to admit, last night when you sent me all the info to get this going locally, having that env file was super convenient because less than actually about 5 minutes.
Yeah.
Just plug those values you gave me, and it was up and running. So that was pretty cool.
Yeah, nice. Yeah. Super good feedback, and it's interesting because every time I demo this, I get that same question. It's like, what is that env file? But it's very popular way to develop. So I think it's just maybe not popular in Java.NET yet, but is extremely popular in Python world for sure.
And just to be clear, the env file does not end up in your repo, right? It's supposed to be per user.
Yeah. So what I do is I publish always.env.tmp. And this allows you to check this in, commit this file, but not this one. So if this one has any secrets, in this case, it doesn't really have any secrets. I'm using Key Vault now, so I don't have the Cosmos key here. And these are public, well-known like emulator keys, so they don't really matter. They're already out there in the wild. Yep. And then in my git ignore, I have .env. Yeah, so I'm just git ignoring that .env.
So .NET has something similar, but it's not. It's different, right? So we have this thing called user secret. There's a per user config file for every .NET Core application, and by default, the config provider that's configured in ASP.NET Core and for a worker service will include it. And it basically lets you stay away from having stuff in source control because it is not in source control. And you can use a tool to set and get values, or you can open the file if you know where it is on disk and then like edit it to add stuff to it.
Yeah, I mean, I think I saw that, and I kind of lost interest when it was .NET specific because I knew I'm going to all these languages. I'm like, I just don't want to deal with that. I have a method that works for me, and it works great.
Makes sense.
So, it'd be interesting though, like a side thing is how can we bring the .env, popular world to .NET in a more natural way, kind of make it, part of the ecosystem.
Yeah.
In the API here inside of, what is it, startup, I'm doing the same thing, env load, API in the API, in the service. The web app actually doesn't need it. The only thing the web app needs is the API endpoint, which I'm using in the www root. You have app settings for here and here. And so I'm just using those app settings there because inside of the, let's say, program here, I wasn't actually able to access environment variables from here. I had to do it as part of app settings. And so that's the only Blazor specific thing that I had to do. And I believe it's just because Blazor app runs in the client, doesn't have access to environment variables. So
That's correct.
yeah. Cool. So I got it all running and I had, all of these open in instances, and I'm hitting F5 to start the API, hitting F5 to start the web app and whatever. And so I'm obviously not going to do that every time I want to debug or whatever. And so I containerized each of these. And so you'll see API as a Docker file. And you'll notice here too that I'm installing the CLI for each of these. Think about this like the dev container. I haven't yet created the production container that doesn't include the CLI. But what this allows you to do is use the Azure CLI credential. And so here down in lib identity, I'm creating a chain of credentials. And so it'll try environment variable credential, it'll try Azure CLI credential, and it will try managed identity credentials. And so in this case, because I've taken this all the way to Kubernetes and AKS, I know that Azure CLI credential doesn't work yet, at least with my setup with Kubernetes. And so I popped in environment variable credential here just to get that to work. Actually, in EMV down here, you'll see I actually have client ID, client secret, and tenant ID. And that, the identity of environment credential will automatically pick that up. You'll notice here .env.temp, I just removed those secrets. Everything has a Docker file. And then I did Docker Compose here. And you'll notice same thing here. I'm passing in the env file to that Docker container. So this will create all the images. When you run Docker Compose up, it will build the images and it will start every one of them. And this one depends on the API. So web app depends on the API. And you can also mount volumes. So this is how I was able to use the Azure CLI credential was here, volumes. I can say mount my home Azure to root Azure inside of the container. And it'll automatically pick up that I'm logged in with the CLI locally in the container. So I don't have to do an AZ login inside of the container every time.
It's funny you showed the env file there, John, because I was going to say earlier, hey, that's a good use case for Docker Compose. And I'll have to admit, I hadn't even had time to see this yet. Yeah. So there you go. There's another use case. You said it works on Python, it works on .NET, and definitely because I've used it for Docker Compose more. So that's cool.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it was super handy. And then, it's all working here, but it wasn't like I haven't deployed this to Azure yet. Like this is just me, running locally. And so I looked into a couple of things on basically how to go from Docker Compose to Azure. And I found something which was a container-based app service where you can publish out a Compose file, but it's in preview. So I was going to try that as a next step to just say, okay, I got containers, I got Docker Compose. Now let me get this out in Azure and Docker Compose inside of an app service. And I could obviously, just create an app service for the API, for the web app, for the Q service, and just run them as containers independently. But then I wanted the life cycle management of the containers. Like something dies, I want to bring it back to life and whatever. And just Docker Compose, I don't believe does any of that. And so then I was looking at doing Kubernetes, and
so it does, right? Locally, if you want that, you can have a restart policy on for each container, and you can say restart always.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so as one of the options here, like restart always, something like that.
Yeah. Yep.
Got it.
So
And I wonder if the Azure App Service multi-container supports that. Azure.
I haven't tried that myself on that.
Yeah, this is
so
the
I'm
thing
not
I
sure.
found: creating multi-container preview app using Docker Compose configuration. And then it's
This thing is still in preview. I have no idea. Yeah, I mean, you could do this. The thing is, if you run this on app service with multiple containers, what you end up with is multiple apps on the same VM, basically.
Yeah.
So you don't get the actual spread of the apps across multiple VMs, like how Kubernetes will schedule the pods on different nodes.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, I looked at it and I was like, I don't know, maybe.
Yeah.
And then I'm like, let me just jump over to Kubernetes. And then I was just like, okay, Docker Compose to Kubernetes. And I believe this is how I found Dan's course. What's the URL to that? Let's see. I think it's this one.
That's a good question. I don't think I know it either.
Yeah, so I found this course. I went through, let's just sign in here. I went through each of these options, and I think I skipped over stack. I just didn't know what that was, and I figured I'm probably not going to use it. Go ahead.
Yeah, probably not. It's nice and easy. It's a quick way to get it going if you have Docker desktop. But if you're going to move to Kubernetes anyway, you're probably going to use one of the other options.
Yeah. So then I looked at Compose, and I ran into a bunch of issues just like from the get-go with Compose, with my Compose with a K. So basically, Compose will convert your Docker Compose files to Kubernetes-friendly files. Actually, Kubernetes files. And then Skaffold allows you to basically monitor your project and then rebuild your containers and deploy to your Kubernetes instance automatically, so you don't have to go and do a build and then do another deploy as you're developing. So then I went here and I installed, I got it all running. Actually, let me just show. So Docker Compose up is a command. I just have this shortcut. Let's zoom in here a little bit. I just have a shortcut alias du, which is docker-compose up --build. I was typing that way too many times. And so this will go through and build all the containers, and I'm in the net folder here, and so it will go through, look at this compose file. It will build all those containers, and it will start everything up, and then you just hit the URL. So that's how that works. And so then I went to look at Compose, and I had this at version 3.8. And apparently Compose with a K doesn't support 3.8. So that was the first error I ran into. I had to downgrade to 3.7. And I think that's just a known issue. And then I ran into a bunch of issues with mounting my local folder to the container inside of Kubernetes. That didn't work.
Yeah, volumes are tricky.
It still doesn't work. I found a bug. I'm trying to follow up with Docker Desktop. And I actually pinged Rich Turner because I believe he did some work with them to get WSL2 integrated. And so hopefully he has a contact over there to help. I got a bug filed on that. So that's what led me to use the service principal. And so here I am. And then I generated the Compose files, and being new to Kubernetes, like I just went to I kind of want to learn. I want to learn what it's about, right? So I went here, learned the basics, and it's just like walls and walls of text. Like, and I kind of went through, learned this stuff, did the interactive tutorial, but then I still didn't know like what to do after that. I didn't know like, okay, I have these files. Like, well, what do I do? How do I get this running locally?
You're not alone, John, because I think we all started that way.
Yeah.
Going, what do we do now?
And even if I wanted to say, okay, I have, like, let's say I didn't have Compose with a K, and I wanted to, should we just call it K Compose? Is that how we say it? Or hard K? Compose. Okay, I like that. Compose. It outputted some files, but I didn't really understand what's going on, what mapped to what. And so this is at this point is when I pinged V and said, hey, can you help me with this? V, maybe it's a good time for you to take and show us, how you went from here, Docker Compose, and then just show us how you got it running locally, and then show us how you went to AKS. Sound good?
Yeah. Did you want me to talk about the different, the YAML files that are actually generated from Compose?
Yeah. Can you just go ahead and run the compose command, and then maybe just walk us through what it generated and why?
Yes.
Cool. While they're getting set up, I just wanted to take a quick moment to ask you to give a like, comment, subscribe if you like what you're seeing. Thanks a lot. Let's get back to it.
This is probably I think this was the command that you ran as well, which was just using the convert command, pointing to a Docker Compose file, setting an output directory, and then we were testing out the host path volume. And when you run that, it creates the service YAMLs, the deployment YAMLs, and then also this config map that references that env that we were talking about earlier.
Mm-hmm.
So if we open this, actually we're not using these anyway, so I'm just going to delete them. These are just volume claims for when you deploy it, and if you wanted to use a host path, or you wanted to use a persistent volume.
Eventually, I do for sure want to use that because I want to get the Azure CLI credential working in Kubernetes, for at least for local dev.
So the good thing about Kompose is the fact that it does create these files for you, because it is a pain to start from scratch. And I was talking to John that usually I just find an existing deployment and I copy that and I change the values to what I need it to be. It gives you the YAMLs that you need pretty easily, but it's especially helpful if you have a Docker Compose file. So
it is actually part of the Kubernetes project. Like, it's on GitHub under theirs. And it is updated, but yeah, not as many people know about it. So.
Gotcha. I love it. I mean, it saved me a lot. So
it's a good starter.
Yeah.
It's a good starter, yeah. Especially if you have the Docker Compose file. So yeah, this is a deployment, which in Kubernetes, because it is a declarative system, the deployment will basically describe how you want your pod, pretty much. And so you can describe I think you can describe up to, n numbers of containers in here. So a pod can have one or more containers in here. And so we have all of these environment variables that reference a config map that was also created by Kompose, which I'll show. And then there's just the image name, which is your local image. And then we added this volume mount. Yeah?
So do people typically do one container per pod?
Yes, there are cases where you'd want like a sidecar container for a lot of different reasons. But yeah, generally, if you have a single service, it's a single container in a pod.
I think of sidecars like the new framework plugins for clusters. So it may not be your own code being plugged in as sidecar, but it could be like a thing that runs in the cluster that's trying to add behavior to your app.
Exactly, yeah. That is the deployment. Here's the service for that deployment, and this is basically just an endpoint given a pod. And so this uses a selector on this label, and this label was provided by Kompose, but that really could be anything.
Yeah, that was something I kind of skipped over, and I know when I removed it, it didn't like it. And then when I just left it alone. So, I mean, I think earlier you said a bunch of this stuff's not required, but I think the label is required, isn't it?
Yes. So you do want to label your deployment so that your service, or your pod at least, so your service knows which pod that it's referencing when people try to hit its endpoint.
Got it.
Okay, and then these are the ports that kind of, I think, were described in the Docker Compose. So we can just leave those. This is where's the config map? Oh, here it is. This is the config map that was generated with all the values. So that's pretty much it. And there's a deployment and a service per service. So we have 3 pairs in there, I think. New pods are created given a deployment. So if we were to just create this as a pod is like a single instance running thing in Kubernetes. And so once you delete it, it's gone because a pod is just a pod, but a deployment, you can have replicas. And this one we're specifying at least one needs to be running all the time. And so once a pod is killed or something happens to a pod, it will spin up a new one to make sure this declaration is true always.
Gotcha.
And then we do label it with this iCompose key with this value. And then we tell the service to send traffic to this deployment with this label.
Yeah. So Dan, you said that you remove a bunch of the stuff. I think you keep the label, right?
I always rename them because theirs are, that IO Kompose service key, which I don't really like.
So you just do like a global replace of that?
Yeah, well, typically, but a lot of times I'll have multiple labels. I'll have, for instance, a tier. I might have a tier of dev or stage or prod in some cases, and then just the name, like they have there.
Gotcha.
They also add like creation date and a bunch of metadata that I typically will take out just because I don't need it. Probably should put that, but I don't.
Okay.
Yeah, but other than that, like you said, I think it's just it just saves you time. It's like not a tool you have to use.
Gotcha. When you say you copy and paste, do you have examples and resources that that you pull from, or is it your own personal, or is there like a repo that you go to get those examples?
I usually just go to either the Kubernetes docs themselves to copy the deployment sample that they have in there. The other thing is our docs, Microsoft Docs has a sample deployment to AKS with the Azure voting app deployment. Gotcha. So I just take that. But those are, yeah.
All right, I'll link to that.
Standard, I wanted to show what we see when we just apply what is given to us. Actually, if I do apply this folder right now, there are a couple things that I did add to make sure that we can access the services. One of it is this Nginx deployment so that we can have an ingress controller to handle traffic to the web app piece and to the API service as well.
Yeah, so when I got it kind of running-ish, and I would hit the endpoint and nothing would happen, and so I was like, okay, I got all this running, but I can't actually hit the endpoint. It turns out the IP was an IP of I think it was the cluster or the node, I'm not sure, and so it's not available to my local machine.
Yeah.
And so then I did a bunch of research, which was like a bunch of Googling on how to hit, your container. And I was thinking it would be this super easy thing. But it turns out it's just not. And there's no super clear guidance on how to do what you're going to do. And so I think this is something that we can, this step is something that we can help people figure out. There's definitely a gap there.
Yeah, I think there is if you specify like a node port on these services for each of your deployments, I didn't try this, but if you did, then you would be able to ping it from your local host.
Yeah, I tried that. Couldn't get it to work.
So the node port has to go on service, right?
Right.
And there's node port, there's load balance service, doesn't work locally. There's one more, I can't remember the name of it.
Cluster IP.
Yeah, and that's the one you don't want.
Yeah, you quickly find that out.
Yeah, and I mean, so by default, Kubernetes, the networking is all about internal cluster-based services, and you have to basically expose explicitly what you want to expose to the outside world. All right, that's the mindset shift. So even though if you were on an app service, one of your services would be the main entry point,
Mm-hmm.
It's similar here. You have to kind of pick one of the services to be your entry point service, because it has no idea which things you want to be exposed or not. So it assumes by default you're internal to the cluster. So everything has its own cluster IP uniquely, and then you have to expose one of those services, or have ingress to the whole cluster to route to your internal services.
I tried node port, didn't work. I don't know what I was doing wrong. And I couldn't find like a really good example. And then the examples I found were mainly for Linux-based systems, not Windows, not Docker Desktop, not WSL2. And so I kind of got into this like networking nightmare kind of thing. So anyway, yeah, this is why I think this Nginx is here, right?
Yeah, so the Nginx is here to be able to have a single entry point, because once you're in the cloud, then you'll need to have this a single entry point to route between the web app to the API from the web app. But I wanted to show here, this is how you actually are exposing the Nginx service to your local host. And so if we did something similar to these individual services, we would be able to hit them directly.
Okay.
But so for this,
but that's only local. Like that wouldn't work in the cloud,
exactly.
right? So okay, got it.
There's no way that I'm aware of that you can make the load balancer, the networking work the same way with the same manifest, both locally and remotely. Because when you're on bare metal, you don't have the load balancer option. And when you're in the cloud, you need to use the load balancer to route traffic from Azure's network or any network on the cloud to your cluster.
This is the ingress deployment, and then these are the ingress rules pretty much that I added, because without them, then we would just hit which actually we can see.
One of the things that I noticed when you were doing that you had to expose the path for each of the unique endpoints. So images, image hub for the SignalR stuff. So why is that? Like, why can't we just say, all paths should work for 2080?
Well, because we're routing from root to the web app.
Okay.
But then routing, I guess we could probably come up with a different regex to handle this. But for me, since I was testing individually, because I was looking at the network, I was expecting the network, and I was inspecting the network and seeing what was failing. I saw that this one was failing, and I saw that this one was failing, and I just added. And I felt like it would be easier to just add these.
Gotcha. So you're saying path could be a regex?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Interesting. Okay.
You shouldn't need those 3 routes, I don't think, for the second set.
Yeah, so it's kind of like, I know it's Blazor, but it is the JavaScript.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And I've hit this a million times where you're like, why isn't this working? And then you're like, oh, shoot, this isn't coming from the cluster. It's coming from the browser.
Yeah, this is why I am dubious about the way to do this. Like, I would probably have a backend that was the backend for the front end that was proxying stuff to the backend. Because the issue is that you end up having to turn on CORS. Yeah. And CORS is a nightmare.
Yep.
And you basically have two web servers, right? The Nginx hosting the Blazor client-side assembly, the client WebAssembly, and then the backend. Yeah, this makes sense now.
Yeah, for CORS, I just enabled all clients, all.
I think that's what we all do to get it working.
I'm like,
and then of course, if it was a real app and we go to production, we forget to take that out,
Of course, yeah.
Have the necessary routes that we need, and then this config map changes the API endpoint. Well, it basically replaces the app settings JSON file, which I'll show you the volume mount in the deployment, with the local host's node port that we set in here. And then actually I have not mounted yet. I need to mount that. I was going to show that failing. Do you want to see it failing and then adding it and then it working?
Sure.
So we just apply this.
It always makes me feel better, V, when it fails and then all of a sudden it works. You're like,
Oh
yes.
yeah. So is it pretty standard that everybody creates an alias for cube cuddle to K?
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah.
I did right away.
That's how I knew V was a pro.
Yeah.
I never do. I'm a noob still.
I typed it like twice and I was like, okay, I'm done.
It's good to see this though. I mean, it's actually fun watching someone else use Kubernetes because like the whole reason we're working on Tye is to simplify a bunch of these flows, and this makes it more evident why it has to be done.
I think it's trying to go to Docker Hub, it looks like.
To the ACR.
Or ACR instead of local. Yeah.
Interesting.
What case is this? Is this like Minikube? Oh, Docker.
Yeah,
Desktop.
Docker.
I see. Docker desktop.
I've
never turned this on, not once.
Yeah.
Oh, it's pretty awesome,
that's
actually.
all I use actually.
Yeah, it's really good.
I don't believe you.
Especially with the WSL2 integration.
Yeah, especially that's true. I mean, I'm on I switch between Mac and Windows a lot, but
Yeah.
on Mac it works phenomenal. But now that Windows has WSL2, it's like amazing with Linux. Yeah.
So one of the things I did have to do was change the pull policy
That's
to
right.
never.
Yeah, I've had to do that
To
too.
never?
Yeah.
Well, if not
Because-
present, right?
Or yeah, if not present, I guess either.
I put it on never because that was what
Exactly.
worked. But if not present, so
Yeah, that's the normal one, if not present.
this is
Yeah.
also something I had to Google as well, as it was just not working locally, and so I had to go through and set all these. So if
Yep.
not present, it'll first look locally, and then if it's not there, we'll pull it. You just have to
Yeah.
make sure they're there.
I think the default is always for.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think you're right.
This is crazy hard. This is just like reinforcing everything we're doing.
Yeah, my whole Kubernetes experience was not enjoyable.
No, until you get the like I saw V did. She didn't describe it, but that's how I know she's done this quite a bit. She did the K describe to debug the command, and it's like until you know some of those things, it's really hard at first. But yeah.
So this is that failing.
Mm-hmm. So we reload and it should fail here. And this is because it's trying to go
2080.
here.
Gotcha. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
And so then we add the volume. Well, first we should just create the volume, then we'll show how we mount it.
What's in the volume?
So the volume,
config map.
the config, yeah,
I
it'll
see.
just be the app settings file. So I'm looking at a sheet next to me because
Yeah.
I was gonna say, if you're doing this from memory, I'm really impressed.
no, definitely not. Otherwise, I would, copy paste them somewhere.
Yeah, this type of stuff I always have to go look up.
So this path is set in the container. When I create the container, I push to var dub web.
Oops. Yep. I'm doing this. That's the mount. This is the actual volume that we're describing.
Right.
So this is the config map, and then the name of the config map is settings.
Gotcha.
And then we mount it.
So is the K apply smart enough to know that I need this config map web settings, and therefore I have a dependency on it? Therefore, I'm going to make that available. Like in Terraform, if you reference something else, it'll automatically build up the dependency chain.
Yeah,
No, it's not that smart.
I don't think it'll do that. That's where that -F comes in, for the folder. And
Yeah, that's what I
don't-
mean. Like, even though you're pointing it to the folder, like it has to process web-config map first before this, right?
Oh, no, it does
No.
do that.
Wait,
It'll make sure they're loaded though.
does it?
Yes.
Yeah,
You sure?
yeah. You don't have to worry about order when you do
Well-
the apply command.
I guess it
The thing
depends.
is, all this is doing is updating is updating the database on the API server on Kubernetes, right?
That's correct.
Nothing happens until it actually runs.
That's exactly. That's why the order, I guess, doesn't matter probably.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because Terraform is all client side,
until
so it has to
runs,
actually
okay,
do
gotcha.
ordering.
Yeah, so I wouldn't have figured this out, like how to do the volume mounts. Would kind of, yeah, I spent too many hours on volume mounts, like to actually know when to use subpath and all of that was pretty confusing.
Volumes by far, I don't know, V, what you think, but they're, in my opinion, the most difficult part of Kubernetes in general is just there's so many of them. It's crazy. Now, one thing I wanted to point out real quick, can you go to that config map real quick, V?
Which one? This one?
Yeah. So just in case anyone's watching and wondering what the heck, see that pipe thing on line 6 there, the pipe dash? And then notice how the key is actually, there's two ways you can do this. You can do key value pairs, or you can have it loaded like a file. And that's what this is doing, is kind of like a file. So if you can go back to your deployment now.
So that will overwrite anything that's in that file.
Yeah, so see the mount path that she did? It's kind of weird. There's two ways to do it, though. So you have volume way, and then you have just kind of an in-memory key value way.
Yep, and so this is actually how you do it with the value.
Yeah.
This is an example of how you
Gotcha.
do it with the value.
So question, isn't that easier to use the value? To just set an environment variable?
So my opinion is it is, but we have to,
You need that file.
yeah,
You
we need to
sure?
replace this file for
I don't think
the
so.
for the web app.
Because can Blazor read from environment variables from the client?
So here's the question: isn't Blazor getting that environment? No, I guess it's like isn't. I see. The file gets actually sent to the client. Yeah, you're right.
It would be wonderful
yep,
if
yep,
it
yep,
could
yep,
read
yep,
environment variables, because I got hung up on that for a bit.
No, this is WASM, so it has to actually
Yeah, I know.
download that stuff from the server side before it runs.
Another benefit that you'll find with this approach is you can change the file, and as long as your app is able to pick up the file change, you're good. But if you do the other way that
Yep.
V showed, and you change the config map, your environment variables in the container won't pick up that change. So that's another
Gotcha.
kind of difference.
You need to reapply.
So there is a caveat to that. That is true if you are mounting the config map to a directory, but since we're mounting the file itself, we have to actually either redeploy or just delete the pod so that it reloads.
Oh, you're right in that case. Yep,
Yeah.
that's true.
So I think I saved this, and we can go back and reapply. And because we didn't get like a YAML validation error, I'm going to say yes. Nice.
Which reminds me, have you used Octant? Octant. I found it yesterday. Oh, cool. It loads.
Nice.
And then we can try adding random mean.
Octant is a web UI to Kubernetes. And it is amazing. Like yesterday,
It's a dashboard, right?
yeah, when I was debugging with V yesterday, and she's like, "Hey, have you done describe on blah blah blah?" I was like, "No, but I'm gonna load the web app," and you can drill down into the pod and just see it real quick. Actually, let me just.
Nice. I'm looking at the website now. Yeah, octant.dev.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the VMware team that builds like Kubernetes tooling, they built this tool, and it's a client-side tool to basically like manage Kubernetes,
Octant. Yep.
to visualize it and manage it.
Learn something every day. I like it.
Yeah, it's going to be my go-to. And I was working with Kubernetes for maybe 2-3 weeks and hadn't heard of this, and I saw a tweet from somebody talking about it. But yeah, like just having to navigate all of those CLI commands with like, okay, what is pod, what is describe, what is logs, what is whatever. It's kind of overwhelming. I don't know if you call it like CLI command overload or whatever. Yeah, you can like drill down workloads and then pods. Yeah.
Did you use the Kubernetes dashboard and just didn't like that or
Oh,
something?
is there a Kubernetes dashboard?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
It
So-
comes with. It comes with.
Cool. Yeah, I haven't seen it, but definitely dashboard.
Octant runs client side. The dashboard runs in the cluster.
Oh.
So you
okay.
can't even access it from your local machine?
No, you can if you run our magic command that does all the port forwarding and launches a browser for you.
Yep. Gotta.
Nice.
But
Dan,
that's
have you
what it
used
looks
this?
like.
I have not. Yes, the dashboard. To be honest, I don't use it. I normally go. If you want to really go all out, you do like Prometheus with Grafana. And I'll do that typically because Grafana has amazing dashboards, like out of the box, that'll give you everything that you ever want to know, way more than you want to know about your pods.
Gotcha. Okay.
But to be clear, this thing is both for those kinds of things, but it also lets you remote into the pod, view logs, kill pods, restart
This-
pods, scale.
The Octant one does as well, or are you saying the dashboard?
The dashboard, both,
Oh.
yeah.
Both.
if I already have the dashboard, why do I need Octant?
Sorry, the dashboard doesn't come with Kubernetes locally, as far as I know. It does come in the cloud version. So AKS has the dashboard installed already.
Right. Yeah.
Gotcha. Okay. So yeah, it was a bit more work. I do remember seeing this, and it was like wall of text, do all of this stuff, and then I found Octant. I was like, okay, all you do is just run Octant. It just works. They must just be under the covers calling the CLI or something.
Well, and getting the security thing set up for the dashboard can be a little tricky too. You got to set up the RBAC stuff, and yeah, it's lots of fun.
So we got it all running locally. Congrats.
Right. Now we want to bring it up to Azure. And so I think you asked me to give a little bit of an overview of what AKS is.
Yeah, that'd be good.
But AKS is pretty much a managed Kubernetes service. And so the control plane is completely managed by Azure. And that takes away having to have the responsibility of managing that bit of it. What you do have to manage are the agent nodes themselves, because that's what you'll be deploying on and primarily be working with. So when you deploy, this is the command I ran. I use the Azure CLI usually when I'm interacting with Azure.
Sorry, question. So before AKS, people just spun up their own VMs and just ran Kubernetes on a VM?
Good luck.
Yeah, well, there's some
Is that what they
Exactly.
did though?
You know how hard it is to set up Kubernetes locally yourself?
Yeah.
Super hard, but yeah.
You got to do, yeah. And
But is that what
we used to
people did?
joke back in the day that you had to have a PhD in Kubernetes to set up Kubernetes. You know, it was
Gotcha.
kubeadm now is the the go-to, and it's a lot better. But yeah, AKS is amazing compared to what the old way was.
So just don't even look into it.
And so actually AKS under the hood uses AKS Engine, but you can also use AKS Engine so that you can have the ability to manage your own control plane. But if you don't want
Gotcha.
that overhead, then AKS is usually what people use.
Gotcha. And so for this Azure CLI, did you have to install anything special, or is the AKS just a command module or whatever that's already installed?
Yeah, it should be already installed.
Got it.
Yeah, and so I just created a really the simplest basic default version, which I can show. When you create an AKS cluster, a secondary resource group is created, and this is where your agent nodes and other cluster-specific resources reside. But then in the resource group that you deployed the cluster to is just this one resource so that you can manage other resources if you had to.
Got it.
As a whole. So right now in here, as a default, the cluster uses virtual machine scale sets, which allows you to really easily scale your nodes. And I think there's 2 or 3 as a default are the nodes.
So how many nodes run on a VM?
Well, one VM is one node.
Okay.
Yes.
And is there a base image that AKS uses? So for example, I know like some VMs start up faster than others. Like, do you know what that base image is?
They do have, actually, so don't quote me on this. I know that they have one for Linux, and then they were also working on one for Windows, or the opposite. They had one for Windows, and they were working on one for Linux.
And can you change it?
You cannot change it.
Okay.
Not right now, anyway.
Okay.
I don't know if they're planning on making that.
Gotcha.
Allowing
Hard to
that.
guarantee it when people are randomly popping in VM scale sets. VM scales. Yeah. Okay. Got it.
And can I ask you a quick question, V? So when on the Windows containers, like say I wanted to run, I don't know, IIS or something, that now I know you can join Windows containers into Kubernetes cluster. If I remember, it's fairly recent. They added that. Is that something AKS does, or has it done that, where you can run Linux and Windows containers?
Yes, it can now.
Okay.
And you can add, or there is, if you able to add nodes or add Windows nodes onto your cluster, then you'll need to configure AKS with Windows credentials at the beginning. Actually, they might have changed that. But when they first allowed that, then you needed to describe your Windows credentials for those VMs. But once you describe them, then you should be able to add and remove Windows nodes just the same as Linux nodes.
Okay, that's awesome, because there's been multiple companies before my new jump to Microsoft that was kind of a big hindrance from using AKS, because they wanted to move some of their legacy apps, into Kubernetes. So it sounds like we can now. So that's cool. Awesome.
Yep. So in order to easily connect to your cluster, you run this get credentials command. AKS get credentials, give it the name and the resource group. And that merges the cluster context to your current context. And so if I do a get nodes now, I should be able to see the AKS nodes.
So it changes your current context to your AKS context, but leaves your local context alone, right?
Yeah, it just adds it to this file.
And you don't have to switch to it.
Right. If you run this command, it's pretty much doing the switching for you.
And you want to go back, you switch context to default or whatever?
So you can list your contexts here. This is that local
got it.
cluster, and this is the one in Azure.
Cool.
And then if you want to change, you just say use context and give it the name. Cool. So we don't have anything running right now. But what I did do was deploy an Nginx controller, and I just used the Helm install Nginx.
Okay. So I noticed you did.
Helm.
Go ahead.
When do we install Helm?
Oh, I have it. So first you install Helm, and then you install the Nginx deployment, or the chart, I should say. And I did this because in our local development or local environment, we use this bare metal deployment. And so, and this uses the node port, which allows us to access it from our host. And so using this chart, it uses a load balance type of service.
I got a question for you. One thing. So a couple of new things that I'm seeing. The -n, I believe, means namespace, right?
Yes.
And can you tell me, teach me about that? Like why namespaces?
Okay, yeah. So namespace really is just like a logical isolation. You can further isolate if you wanted to based on namespace, but you'll have to do all of that manually. But the reason that people use namespace is to kind of, well, either to separate the different logical components. So in this case, we have the controller, the Nginx controller as its own thing. And I don't want it to be coexisting with the other resources, because once I start deploying things, I can easily delete a namespace, create a new namespace, and things like that. And so this is a constant thing. And so I just rather have it in its own namespace.
So kind of what I'm mapping it to mentally is kind of like a resource group, where it's like a logical grouping.
Yeah.
As far as Azure goes. Okay. And then I actually haven't installed Helm at all. Like I haven't even used it. I've heard it's like some sort of package manager for Kubernetes. And so, is that pretty much right?
Yep. Yeah. So actually, in one of our conversations, you were talking about how we would go from using these, or it was the opposite because my PR actually had my Docker repo in it, but how we would go from the Docker repo to local and vice versa. And so these images, as we'll see or not, we'll probably get an error image pull because this doesn't exist. And so I do have them pushed to my Docker repo. And so I'd go in here and I'd have to change each and every one of them. But if I had like something like a Helm chart, then I wish I had one I can show you, but you would be able to just change one file, one location, and it'll template out the YAML for you.
Yeah, that was actually one of the things I looked at immediately, was how to templatize basically these YAMLs, and it doesn't look like that's easily discoverable as well. How do you go to say put a different ACR URL in front of this, and so you're
I wish
What's that
they
thing
have
called?
that.
Go ahead.
There's a thing. What's it called? It's kube control. Someone tell me what it is.
Customize.
Customize, right? That.
So it's called a Helm chart, not a package. Okay,
Not manifest.
gotcha.
Is the chart the actual? Yeah, the chart. The chart is the manifest, right?
Yes.
Gotcha.
So there's a bunch of things that you can describe, but this is generally the structure of a chart. So you usually have a directory with the chart, with whatever chart you're trying to create a template for. And so in these values is where you can specify different custom values. So here you can specify change the repository here. And the way that it does that is in here. And if you look in the templates, this is actually all of the YAML that is created, depending on certain things. So I bet you if we look at certain things, they'll have a condition on it. So this is only created if you have admissions webhook enabled.
Gotcha.
And let's see, we can do a deployment here. This is, I think, enabled by default, and the image, you can concatenate different values together to create the actual image.
Gotcha.
But yeah, so this is just the syntax of Helm templating.
Cool. Thank you.
So I deployed that. The service type was load balancer, which if you create in Azure, it creates a load balancer for you in your cluster resource group. So actually, let me refresh this.
Cluster resource group. How do you get here again? I forget. Yeah.
This is the resource group I deployed to, and then it just creates one prefix.
I see.
The resource group, the cluster name, and then the region.
And it made VM skill sets, a virtual network, public IP address, two of them. I see one for the dashboard maybe, or the API server, and then one for
Yes.
Kubernetes. I see. Got it.
Well, this one is the one that I think we just created. The
See,
load
I'm
balance.
learning Azure.
I'm actually not sure what this one is for.
My guess is the API server, because one is for like kube control to even work with your Kubernetes cluster.
This one, yeah.
And
Usually
then one
it's
is for your
named
ingress,
something.
right? I see.
Yeah, but okay. So, and also this route table, I think is created specifically because it's using the Azure networking interface, or yes, is the default. But you can specify different networking interfaces if you wanted to. That's the default. And so if we go here now with just the Nginx deployment, we're hitting the default backend, which comes default, which is what we wanted to see. At least we're hitting this correctly. And so if I go in here, I want to basically not deploy this because we already have something, an Nginx there for us, but we still want to create these rules, and everything is pretty much the same except for this. So we'll want to change this to, because this is the endpoint, public endpoint of our Nginx controller.
So how does it know to go to the port that, the API port, or the API port?
Yeah, so in these
I
paths,
see.
we specify the service port that we're expecting it on.
So they're all hitting kind of the same IP, but then it's translated to that port.
It's forwarded to this service at this
Yeah,
port.
great.
Yeah.
Cool. Now, because our context has changed, this is going to point it to AKS. Gonna
Right.
Apply to AKS. Okay.
Yep, so we're getting that image pulled back off because we have those. Images don't exist, and so I'll change it to my public repo, which I have these images pushed to.
Gotcha. And so it's okay. So my normal process probably would be do a Docker build, push to Docker Compose build or whatever, push to ACR, and then deploy, or then apply kubectl apply, so it would pick up those latest images. Okay, it'd be interesting to see what the the CD pipeline for Kubernetes project. I mean, that's not not something we need to cover today or whatever, but to say let's say we have this all set up. I mean, it's out on GitHub or some repo, and we want to automatically deploy changes to an environment. Just that kind of workflow is kind of, I think, probably the next step of what I'll explore. Yeah.
And one thing to note is that this is this is not considered best practice, and to just leave it as latest all the time. We'll actually want to specify an exact image tag here.
Gotcha.
So that you're remaining consistent and not pulling the latest, which could be anything.
Okay.
Which means you need more tools like Helm.
Right.
Yeah.
So that you can, or I mean, if you're using customize, then you can just change the value in the customized file.
Yeah, you gotta generate a version somehow, and ugh.
Yeah, I usually use, I'm old fashioned. I have a PowerShell script or a SH script I use. And it gets the job done. I have to pipe it. So I have to run the command and then pipe the output to the apply command, but it works.
I gotta say, watching this is extremely painful. Just like the amount of stuff that has to be done to make this run.
I agree.
Kind of insane.
Yeah, it's involved. It's not for the faint of heart.
Oh my God.
But once you have it all there, then it's just pretty, and that's I guess that's why it's so important to have your CI/CD in place.
Yeah,
I was literally just going to say that without CI/CD, you're kind of dead in the water.
The thing is, once you have a cluster set up already with ingress, so I guess some of this was setting up the cluster to begin with. If you have a cluster and you have ingress and you're adding services, and that bad.
Right.
The issue is like when you're bringing the whole thing up, you have to add so much stuff. And one thing that occurs to me now is that your local dev Kubernetes manifest, it can't be the same as your remote one, and that's kind of a blocker. Feels like.
Yeah. Also, think about. I mean, every single dev like me over the past couple of weeks has gone through this. Right? They've felt this pain exactly like I felt.
So
Yep.
yeah, Tye solves all these problems. I mean, it isn't the panacea, obviously, but like, it makes most of this pain go away.
Yeah. So
Super.
so let's celebrate. We got this on AKS. It looks like it's all working.
So, question: did we put the IP address in the config file? Is that what we did?
Yeah.
And this is the IP address of the ingress.
Yeah.
Right.
Cool. Now, let's say I make a change, and I want to run that in Kubernetes again. I need to now like build my containers, apply my deployment. Well, first of all, change the context back to local if I want to debug local. Remove that Vita tag. All of this stuff just to do a single change, right?
Yeah. Well, yeah. I guess there are ways to solve that. Is you can have a directory for your dev, your local. You can have a directory for your prod, and that's actually how you can solve that with Customize, actually. So.
And Dan talks about this thing called Skaffold, which it seems like helps with that local inner loop. And David is working on this project called Tye. So I want to spend at least just like a couple minutes talking about each of those, just because I feel like I'm going to be doing that a lot within a couple of weeks, and I selfishly want to learn. But also, I think it's a good part of the dev cycle, at least the inner loop dev cycle. So
the other thing, too, just wanted to throw this out there, is like adopting the GitOps model for CI/CD, which basically uses the GitOps, the GitHub or repo as a source of truth, and you have an operator clusters, whether that be a dev or a prod or a local cluster, that continuously checks a repo. And so for this is just an example. I have a dev and a prod environment that I want, and I currently just imagine that there is a operator running on a prod instance that's pointed to this directory, and then I have an operator running on a dev cluster pointing to this directory. And this kind of uses the Helm operator, but just ignore that for now and just consider these just regular YAMLs that you're used to. This could just be regular YAML that you're used to, and in the prod customization, I'm just like, well, I don't really want to change anything in the base, just do it as is. In the dev one, I want to also deploy an Nginx controller that has this stuff, but also
so instead
patch.
of you renamed it to .tmp or whatever.
Exactly.
Okay, interesting.
And then you can also patch any of these YAMLs with. So right now I have a different reference to a chart, but you can do a different image tag or a different image.
So my question about this that I always wanted to ask someone. Do you check hard versions into this thing? So you check in specific versions, right, of the images?
So yes, to different branches. I mean, there's a bunch of different workflows that you can do, but yeah, we have.
So the flow is that somebody checks in source code, a new version gets produced on the container registry, and then somebody updates this file. Some process will say like, I have version 10 now, put a version 10 somewhere, check it into this repo, and then something else will run and kube control apply this, or Helm install this into the cluster.
Gotcha.
So you're actually checking hard values like for the specific deployment into source control. Right.
Yes, yeah. And then you don't store any sensitive information.
Except for secrets. Yeah.
Yeah.
Can I ask a question real quick to V? You mentioned the operator.
Mm-hmm.
Is that one that like your group wrote or you wrote, or is there one out there that automatically can check? Because that's interesting. I hadn't heard of that approach before.
Yeah, the Flux operator by Weaveworks is actually the one that people use the most. And it's a CF sandbox project and has a lot of contributors to it, and people have been using it more and more these days. So this is the one that I use, I'm talking about, and I can send.
Yeah, very nice. Okay. Yeah, operators are one of those still mysterious to me things. I see the value for like setting up, you want to shard a MongoDB database, for example, and you could just install their operator. I get that, but now I'm going, oh, that's kind of cool. You can do what you mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Excellent. Thanks.
Dan, do you want to just give us the pitch on Skaffold?
Yeah, sure. I actually have one up and running here, so it'll be pretty quick to show.
While they're getting set up, I just wanted to take a quick moment to ask you to give a like, comment, subscribe if you like what you're seeing. Thanks a lot. Let's get back to it.
Yeah, so the idea with Skaffold is, and I'm interested with what David's going to show because it might really nicely tie into this, I suspect. But, if you're building, for instance, a lot of microservices and you kind of need that in a Kubernetes environment to get these services running like they really should be running. The challenge is now if you're developing your app against those, you either A, do a lot of port forwarding, because as we talked about earlier, everything would be a cluster IP by default. And you'd have to set that up, and that's kind of a pain. But the other problem is, if I come in, and I'll just do a real simple example here, and here's the index.razor, which is the kind of homepage we've been looking at, and I change this to, Azure Demo 2, well, now I have to, from the Docker file here, this is an Alpine, Nginx Alpine image. Now I have to go through the publish process, rebuild everything, and that takes a little bit of time. Yeah. Especially on these front end projects where you're pulling packages down, Angular, React, Vue, stuff like that. And so the idea with Skaffold, you can go to scaffold.dev and you can run a scaffold init command. I'll go to the get started here and I'll just show you if we go to working with Skaffold. So only a handful of commands. Scaffold init, you can basically point it at your project and the Docker files and things that are there. It can generate this YAML file that I'll show you in a moment. It's okay. I tend to just do what V mentioned earlier. I have some files and I just copy, paste, tweak. Mm-hmm. It's almost easier, I think. But that's what that is. Now, the next one is this Scaffold dev, which I'm going to show here real quick. In fact, I already am running it. That will do a couple things. So first off, once you have this Skaffold, yet another YAML file, right? Yeah. You have all those Kubernetes ones, you have Docker Kompose and all that stuff. This is kind of what it looks like. It's a real simple file. Now, it does support a lot of different builds, though. I won't go into it, but if you go into, I'd have to find it in here. I think it's down in the references. They have a pretty robust schema. And so like I'm doing the Docker, you'll see right here, but they do Bazel and ones I've never heard of and stuff like that. So it's pretty robust that way. But the idea is that if I'm a dev and I am now, let's say, coming into this, Razor page, which ultimately needs to go into a container, it'd be kind of cool if I could just save and then watch down here in my terminal. See how it picked up the change, and now it's redeploying just the kind of delta, if you will, that's needed.
And only that one container, not all of them.
Yeah, exactly.
So instead of running Docker Compose up, I just run Skaffold dev, and it's pretty much doing the same thing.
Exactly. Normally you'd have to either go down or you'd have to stop and remove that one container because you got a new image. I mean, there's a lot to it.
So are you saying like I probably don't even need Docker Compose at this point?
For this, it kind of depends where you want to run things. If you're going to run now I'm on Docker Desktop, and I have the, just real quick here, if we go to preferences, I have the Kubernetes. There's just a checkbox you can check, which you've already seen, I know, John.
Yeah.
So I have that enabled. I'm not in the experimental. Experimental now has 118, I noticed, but this image I'm not, or this machine I'm not. Once that's enabled, if I just wanted containers running, then I would say Docker Compose is fine, because there is some knowledge you have to have with Skaffold about, you'll notice right here at the bottom,
Right.
it's pointing to your, what V just went through, all the YAML. So it's not like you could just use this and then go, I don't have to know Kubernetes, because at some point you're probably going to hop over and do a get all or something to debug a situation.
Right.
But what's nice about it is it will automatically sync up. And then I didn't add it here. I put a quick GitHub link. So this project, and I could have done it for this one too. What you'll find though is if you change a file, like in, for instance, a React or an Angular front end type app, and if your Docker file is building a production image, then it has to repull all the packages. And now you're looking at, 3 to 4 minutes in some cases to build that image. Not a good dev experience, right?
Yeah.
So what you can do there is they also have this sync functionality. I mentioned this in the chat last night that I wouldn't have time to do. I got this going like 10 o'clock last night.
Yeah.
But what it'll do is it'll monitor the dist folder, which in this case, this is an Angular app.
Okay.
And anytime that changes, it'll automatically only deal with that particular path in the container. So it's basically a way to sync the files without having to totally rebuild the image.
Now, do you have to change your Docker file at that point? To say like mount the local folder or anything?
No.
Okay.
No changes there. It just does some it's a little bit of sleight of hand magic, I'll admit, that they're doing.
So
and
that's cool because
right there.
All of your node, your node packages, node modules, all of that doesn't need to be recopied.
Exactly.
Gotcha.
Because that'll just kill you if you're trying to do live development against that. I mean, your boss would be like, "What are you doing?" "Oh, I'm getting another coffee,"
Yeah.
Because I'm building.
5 minutes. Yeah. Okay. Gotcha.
So the idea here is all you have to do, though, you'll see in the artifacts, is you give it the image, and this is, of course, a local image in this case. Context is just your root folder, and then here's the Docker files that, John, I'm guessing you created.
Yeah.
So all I did literally was I went and side by side looked at what you had in the Docker Compose. I copy and pasted a Skaffold file I had, and then I just tweaked these items here. And then I pointed to your manifests that are up here that V went through.
So it's using instead of the .env file, it's using the config, the Kubernetes config, right?
Yeah.
Gotcha.
So this is using the config maps. It's all, so in a nutshell, it's all Kubernetes on my desktop.
Yeah.
But with the power to leave like, for instance, if let's say David did, 15 microservices.
Yeah.
And I'm just worried about the web app part. Well, now I don't have to worry about redeploying everything, take it all down, bring it back up. I can just work on my one part, and let me do one more. I'll save, and then it'll detect that, and we're done. It's like literally, it's that fast.
Yeah. No, that's great. I mean, that was even on my little project that change would take minutes.
Yeah.
Yeah, because on Docker Compose, you got to stop and start everything pretty much. I mean, I could just run one container and do all that, but okay, yeah, that's cool.
Yeah. So in a nutshell, that's Skaffold, and there's a lot more you can do, of course, but that's the nutshell version.
Nice. Yeah. Thanks.
Does that? So I know you said you're using the local cluster right now, but does it work for clusters in the cloud?
That is a good. It's funny you say that, V, because earlier I was going, I wonder if this would work with AKS, because it'd be cool to hook up to what you had, I don't know the answer to that. I haven't tried that. The only thing I guess I'd worry about is there will be times when it does have to build and push the image.
Right.
And, it would just come down to how fast, I guess, your network latency is there.
Mm-hmm.
But cool. I'll tell you what, while David's going, I'll see if I can find info on that.
David, you want to jump into Tye and see what that's about? While they're getting set up, I just wanted to take a quick moment to ask you to give a like, comment, subscribe if you like what you're seeing. Thanks a lot. Let's get back to it.
The inception of Tye was about trying to basically, after I learned Kubernetes, me and Ryan Nowak on the Ethernet team, who's now changed teams, we kind of played with it and said, there's a lot of boilerplate that you kind of have to learn to get something simple going. Yeah. So the intent was, how could we basically make you go from .NET code to Kubernetes as fast as possible? So what we ended up doing was making this tool that basically had a local dev experience and then had a way to deploy to Kubernetes without having to understand or learn Kubernetes. At least that was the intent, right? So I have an app here. It's called Front End Back End. The front end is a simple Ethernet core project. It has it's a simple application. It has a route. It prints out a bunch of information. Mm-hmm. It calls the backend. So front end is an app. It calls the backend application. Backend just returns some information about IP and stuff over JSON. So very simple, right? If you were going to run this locally by hand, what you do is you would launch two consoles. You would run two applications. Mm-hmm. You would pass the IP of the backend to the front end manually via configuration. So we basically said, what if we just made all of that automatic? And we had conventions for flowing config from one app to a different app, and we had a way to run multiple applications. So Tye actually does support running apps without by default. So if I Tye, ignore the YAML for now. If I Tye run, what I get is a local experience. So it builds the application, it builds the projects, it understands .NET, it runs the project, and it gives you a local dashboard for viewing the application. So if I open up this address, mm-hmm. You'll see I have two services, one front end, one back end, and a bunch of URLs. So when running locally, the other super annoying part is port conflicts, right? When you're in containers, it's easier because they have their own space, but you still have to map the container port to your local machine's port, and that is like conflict hell, right?
Yeah.
So Tye tries to basically automate this for you and generate random non-conflicting ports, so you can hit your endpoints. So here's my backend, here's my front end. It's running, calls the backend API. Here are the logs for each service. And we also have metrics, so I can look at the backend and see like .NET performance counters, mm-hmm. essentially.
Gotcha.
So you get an experience, right, where you're like Kubernetes, but you don't have to actually code against Kubernetes. So that's like step 0.
So I just point it to my CS project files.
Yeah.
And just run Tye.
Yep, Tye run. So you either point to a project or a solution. Mm-hmm. And if you need more control, you can actually create a Tye YAML. Gotcha. So if you run Tye init, so Tye itself is a command line tool. There's Tye init, Tye run, Tye build, Tye push, Tye deploy, Tye undeploy, right? Mm. So you can init to create this manifest. The manifest by default has points to your project. So it'll read the solution file and gen this for you. I can also add things like containers. So say I had a front end, a back end, and Redis. I could add here, like, name is Redis, image Redis, and it would run Redis, right, locally. Mm-hmm. I could even expose bindings. This is basically, think of it as a Kompose file, mm-hmm. but it understands projects natively, and it has more conventions that are Kubernetes-like. So for example, just now when I made this application with front end and back end, somehow the front end found the backend's address, even though the port is gen randomly. Mm-hmm. How did that work, right? So normally in Kubernetes, everything in the same namespace can access each other via DNS. So to mimic that, what we did was we added this super lightweight extension method to ASP.NET Core's configuration that is get service URI. And all it does is it reads environment variables via convention that Tye passes into the application on launch. That says when you launch these services, here's the back end, here's the front end, here's the worker, here's Redis. So application code can just call get service URI Redis, and it will resolve the right ports and addresses locally and remotely. Right. So the intent is that you write this code once, and it will and the orchestration process will do the right thing to get the right addresses no matter where you run.
That's nice. That's so much easier. I mean, I could see earlier why you're going, yeah, this is a lot of YAML.
It's a lot of stuff, right? Yeah, and it gets much harder. So for Kubernetes, what ended up happening was you end up having to author a Docker file and a kube manifest, and then you have to build locally, build containers locally, push somewhere, and then like run, right? I said to myself, like, why couldn't we just run locally? Because normally in these environments, people run their apps locally, and then they deploy Kubernetes. It's only when you hit a certain size limit or you can't test your app locally because you need so many other services to run that maybe that doesn't scale, right? But for a good majority of people that only need to test their part of the application when running in a bunch of these scenarios, you run your apps locally in a debugger with your tools. You want to use the tools that you love and learn the whole time, right? While deving. And then when you're finished and you want to deploy, you can type Tye deploy. -I is interactive, so it'll prompt me for input if it needs stuff. And the intent here is that it'll generate for you a Docker file. It'll build your image. It'll push to Docker Hub or ACR. It will gen a kube manifest, and it will kube control apply to your current context.
Impressive.
Cool.
So it basically generates the Docker file, the manifest, and it infers a bunch of those settings from your project because it knows the base image. Because if you're done at Core 3.0, guess what? We know the image is Docker Hub blah 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 3.0, right? So
do you support Blazor yet?
Not in a so someone complained about this not working in a first class way.
I complained. Yeah, I mean the VS Code right now, Docker file gen for Blazor is broken for sure. It basically generates a Blazor
server-side file, right?
Yeah. So I did a whole analysis and sent that to the Blazor team and all that stuff. But yeah, so I was just thinking for my project. If let's say I want to do my own Docker file and there's a Docker file in my project, will it honor that?
Yeah, so you can control the Docker image yourself if you want to. You can specify an image, a project, a container, a Docker file, and we're adding support for Azure Functions soon. So the intent is that, is this working? This is like, Docker is so flaky sometimes. Hopefully it builds.
Is this something that's discoverable right now? Like there's
Tye?
Yeah.
It is currently an experiment as part of .NET 5. So it's brand new and just being built. We're trying to demo it at KubeCon just to show everyone what we're doing. But the intent is to have a class of dev tools around this flow because everything else just seemed like much more work, to be honest.
I agree. I can
get
get all my stuff up, and like you said, I could just debug right in my tool. I don't have to worry about all the other stuff, right?
Yep.
Nice.
Does it have hot reloading like Skaffold?
Yeah. So for local running, you can Tye run watch. This is a brand new feature that we just added.
Okay.
And it will basically watch your project. Watch it. So when you run locally, you're not in Kubernetes. You're running on the machine with a process or with containers. And then when you deploy, you're deploying to Kubernetes.
So when I do Tye run, can I also at that point say I don't want to use that process? I want to use a container instead.
Yeah, you can do this.
Okay.
Tye run Docker, and it will take your application, put it in a container, and run it. Though this was hanging on me just now, so
okay.
I gotta figure out what's failing. Other cool examples that we have just in the repo itself. Here's an app that actually is the Docker voting sample for cats and dogs. So you show a voting screen to somebody, you vote cats or dogs, it gets put into a Redis list, and then there's a background worker polling the list and then storing up bits in Redis. And the results page just uses Signar to show the results in real time. So I have like a voting sample, it has the voting application, it has Redis, and here's the port, it has the worker, environment variables, and then bindings for Postgres. So
I love the string replacement stuff built in. That just works, right? Yeah.
Yep. We had to do that for stuff like this, right? So yeah, the intent is to make it like very much like Docker Compose, but then you can take that experience all the way to deployment by having the same manifest.
Cool. And so can I run, say, on my local Kubernetes cluster, not AKS? You're saying I can, right?
You can, yeah.
Okay. And that's just the, what is it, deploy command?
Yeah.
And does it honor the AKS context?
Yeah, it does.
Okay. Gotcha.
Yep.
And in .NET only, right, for this?
So it was made for .NET. The escape hatch is you can specify a Docker file if you want to. So for example, like here's Angular, and this is very much like Blazor, where the Angular app uses Nginx. The front end has a container right here, Nginx, npm build, and npm install Nginx, and then it does the same thing, right? Same idea. And we also have support for ingress. So if you look at, where is that, ingress? You can say like specify the ingress rules, and we translate these rules into what you saw in the cluster, with the intent being that if you want to test that application flow locally, you can just run this locally, and it will spin up Tye itself will implement the ingress for you, with the intent being that it'll give you a real enough environment so you can verify these rules. And then when you deploy, it'll translate this into the right things so it works on Kubernetes. So as an example of what it generates, so you can see, like, here's an example, right? It just spits out a bunch of these things.
Gotcha. This is the gen.
Yeah. A service, a deployment, all the right labels and tags based on your service names. It versions. It actually appends the version to the app based on your assembly name, your assembly version. So if you have code that versions your assembly based on like git version, it'll pop that into the actual like container image and then put it in the manifest. It injects these environment variables into your application to basically do service discovery between services. So the front end has the backend port and the backend host.
Right. Yeah, I mean, after spending weeks with Kubernetes now, I can definitely see a need for this.
Yeah.
I agree.
No joke.
Yeah.
After spending years, cool. I agree.
Like I'm just pulling my hair out constantly on what seems like mainline scenarios. That prevented me from building apps. I'm stuck on some Kubernetes thing for a week when I could have been building features, and anything to take that away would be great.
I think my hypothesis of this whole thing was Kubernetes was kind of built from the operator side, where managing VMs is hard, and now everyone is trying to shrink it. Everyone's trying to take that big thing and shrink it for devs. So there's Minikube, there's kubeadm, there's all these things to kind of shrink it onto your dev machine to make it work. But there's so much friction in going from like your local dev environment to that local Kubernetes. So tools like Skaffold, right, try to solve it for you by trying to automate more of that flow. But I do think like if you were going to if you're coming from first principles, just run apps locally, you just want to run more than one thing and then have that same topology work somewhere else.
So here's the thing, like, so all of my whole experience, I went from building an app to Docker Compose to Kompose, to Skaffold, like all of that is basically replaced with Tye, right? Because I just build my apps and then run Tye. Like I don't need Docker Compose, I don't need Kompose and I don't need Skaffold.
Right. Yep.
That's so cool. Yeah, I think next steps for me, just do a reaction video. Like, let's get, I'm gonna, get my, just get my app running on Tye and just see if I can get it running.
What's David? What's the you mentioned .NET 5? So is it a go on this yet, or is it still?
It won't be like it won't be production ready in 5, but my guess is during 6 we'll end up having people work on it more. So now we're getting feedback. We're basically like doing surveys, doing customer development with people who are using it, and we have a bunch of customers consuming it and giving us feedback. And then we'll do a report at the end and go like, people, like, this is needed, basically.
Mm-hmm.
Very nice. Yeah, if you need any feedback, I'm more than willing to say this is needed.
Yeah, same.
Or how would we be able to play with this somehow? Okay.
I'm sorry, it's actually open source. So.
Oh, perfect.
Let me show this. Sharing. I'm not sharing anymore, right? Let me share my screen. So github.net/Tye. You can install it. Where's the thing? Documentation.
So I honestly, when I looked at this,
Yep.
my first thought was, oh great, another YAML. And it would be cool if there was a 3-minute, demonstration of why this is good.
Yep.
And maybe it's even just, here's Docker Compose. Here's what I have to do now. Docker Compose, Kompose, Skaffold, like all of that. Okay, now here's what that looks like.
I said the funniest thing during our customer interviews was seeing the reaction of people who understood why this existed, and then the opposite reaction where people who were basically had their toolchain built ready based on Kubernetes and a bunch of their on scripts and PowerShell and stuff, and how they were kind of like, I kind of have a thing that is janky, but it works.
Which is what Dan was saying. He's got his stuff,
Yeah, this looks pretty well. I just like the fact that you could just run the app normal and still bring everything up, because that's really half the battle is, I guess in Visual Studio, you could link up all the projects and set the start order. And, we've had that for forever. Yeah. But what you're doing takes it to the next level.
Yeah. But here's my, so I maybe if I were to just start with Tye, like let's say I'm just getting into this and you pitch Tye to me, I'd be like, yeah, cool, whatever. But because I felt the pain, I get it. So how do we get customers to that point of, understanding the pain, not having to feel it per se?
That's interesting. Yeah.
Pulling their hair out for, whatever, and then lead them to something like this. That's kind of what I think the gap. Anyway, so
Agreed.
I think.
No, you're right.
Anyway, so let's let me take a look at that for sure, and I'll do a follow up. But it's good to see both perspectives and to learn all the different tools and everything that we have to do. Just some big takeaways. The Helm thing, something I'm going to learn about. The templating, customize, Prometheus, and I think Grafana. All of that stuff is just. I feel like these are just tools that are tacked on that because of the operator-centric Kubernetes start, that, there's a ton of these open source things that kind of just that popped up because of that focus.
Yep.
And finding them, knowing when to use which one, all of that stuff. Like I didn't even know all of these things exist before this call. So it's good to, it's good to do that. I wonder, is there a resource that lays everything out for people? With not just like a flat list of, here's all of the Kubernetes related things, but more of, a gradual progression, here's how you get started. Here's the next step.
That'd be a good list. I'm not aware of one that does that approach because in this field, like if you ever say you're bored, you're just not trying hard enough because there's so much, like you said. And I haven't seen anything that walks you through that. The rest of you know of anything?
It's a future Dan Pluralsight course.
Yeah, there you go.
There we go.
In the making. Okay, cool. I definitely got out everything that I wanted to get out of this experience. So thank you all so much, V, for putting in the time, all the upfront time to get it all working and help me learn all this stuff. I
Listening
appreciate it.
to the different tools. That was awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, V, because without all the YAML and stuff, we wouldn't have been able to do much. So
Expert YAML hacking right there.
Dan and David, thank you so much for joining. Your insights definitely appreciated, and I learned a ton, so I appreciate it.
Awesome.
thanks for having us.
Thanks for putting this together, John. Really cool.
Yeah,
Thanks,
absolutely.
John.
Yep. All right, we'll talk to y'all soon.
All right.
All right.
Bye.
Have a
Bye.
good weekend.
Yep, you too.